The results came in at 6:12 in the morning. A single email. Sitting in an inbox. Waiting to be opened. But the man who had been waiting for that email for 11 weeks was already dead. He had been dead for 4 hours by the time the notification arrived. 4 hours. And in those 4 hours, while his body was still warm, while his family was still trying to understand what had just happened, that email sat there. Unopened. Patient. Carrying a truth that would have changed everything. Here is what nobody in that family knew that morning. He hadn't just ordered a routine test. He hadn't been curious about his ancestry. He hadn't been trying to find cousins or trace a family tree. He had ordered that test because he no longer trusted the people living inside his own home. And the results? They didn't just confirm what he feared. They exposed something so much worse. Something that somebody in that family had spent 20 years making sure would never come to light. The question was never just what the DNA revealed. The question was who already knew, and how far they were willing to go to make sure he never found out. His name was Gerald Oak, 54 years old, civil engineer. A man who had spent his entire adult life building things that were meant to last. Bridges. Foundations. Structures designed to hold weight that most people never think about. He was methodical. Patient. The kind of man who double-checked his work not because he doubted himself, but because he understood what was at stake when something failed. He had been married for 26 years to a woman named Vivian. They had 3 children. A son, Marcus, who was 23. A daughter, Celine, 21. And a younger son, Daniel, who had just turned 17. From the outside, this family looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. They owned a house in a quiet part of the city. Gerald drove the same car for 9 years because it worked and he saw no reason to change it. Vivian ran a tailoring business from a studio attached to the back of the house. The children had gone to good schools. Marcus had graduated. Celine was finishing her degree. Daniel was preparing for exams. People who knew them described them the same way. Stable. Grounded. A family that had figured something out that most families hadn't. But people who described them that way were only seeing the surface. And surfaces are exactly what you look at when you have no reason to look deeper. Gerald's closest friend, a man named Emeka who had known him since university, said something later that stuck with investigators. He said Gerald had changed about 8 months before he died. Not dramatically. Not in a way that announced itself. But in the small, specific ways that only someone who knew him very well would notice. He stopped talking as much. He started paying very close attention to things he had always taken for granted. He would sit at dinner and watch his family in a way that felt different. Not warm. Observational. Emeka said he asked Gerald once directly if something was wrong. Gerald looked at him for a long moment and said, "I've been thinking about how much a person can know someone for years and still be completely wrong about who they are." Emeka thought it was a philosophical observation. It wasn't. Something had already happened by then. Something Gerald had seen or heard or found. Something that had quietly cracked the foundation of everything he thought was solid. And Gerald, being Gerald, didn't react. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't raise his voice or make accusations. He started paying attention. He started keeping notes. And eventually, he made a decision that nobody in his family knew about.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.
It started with a photograph. That's the detail that matters because it's always something small. It's never a dramatic confession or an obvious lie. It's something ordinary that refuses to sit still in your mind. Gerald found an old photograph in a box that had been in storage for years. They were clearing out a section of the house, making space the way families do when life gets cluttered. Vivian asked him to go through the boxes in the back room. Standard request. Nothing unusual. He found the photograph tucked inside an envelope inside a folder that had no label. It was a picture of Vivian. She was young in it. 23, maybe 24. Standing in front of a building Gerald didn't recognize. And she was with a man Gerald had never seen before. Now, a photograph of your wife with an unknown man from 30 years ago is not, by itself, alarming. People have lives before marriage. Old friends. People you no longer speak to. Gerald understood this. But it wasn't the man in the photograph that stopped him. It was the date written on the back of it in Vivian's handwriting. The date was 14 months before their wedding. And the location, also written in her hand, was a city she had told Gerald she had never visited. Not once. Not ever. She had told him this specifically, during a conversation he could still remember clearly, because the city had come up and she'd said she'd always wanted to go but had never had the chance. She had been there. She had documented it herself, written the location down in her own hand, and she had never mentioned it to him. Not once in 26 years. Gerald put the photograph back. He put the folder back. He returned everything to the box and continued sorting as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. He started thinking about other things after that. Small inconsistencies he had filed away over the years without examining them. A story that had changed slightly in the retelling. A reaction that had been slightly too fast or slightly too slow. A name that had come up once and then disappeared completely, never mentioned again. Individually, none of these things meant anything. Together, they were beginning to form a shape. He didn't share any of this with Vivian. He thought carefully about whether what he was feeling was paranoia, the kind that sometimes takes hold of a mind that has been working under too much pressure for too long. He genuinely considered that possibility. But he couldn't dismiss what he'd seen. The date. The location. Written in her hand. So he did what he did with every engineering problem he couldn't resolve through reasoning alone. He gathered data. He researched DNA testing services. He read about privacy policies, about how samples were processed, about whether results could be accessed by anyone other than the person who ordered the test. He was careful about this. More careful than someone who was merely curious would need to be. He ordered a kit under a secondary email address he created specifically for this purpose. When it arrived, he didn't open it immediately. He kept it in his car for 3 days. He was not ready. Or perhaps more accurately, he was not sure he wanted to be ready. Because Gerald Oak, despite everything, was still hoping he was wrong. He was hoping there was an explanation for the photograph that he simply hadn't thought of. He was hoping the inconsistencies were the product of an ordinary, imperfect human memory. His own included. He was hoping that when he finally brought himself to run this test, the results would come back clean and clear and he could put all of it down to the fear that comes from knowing nothing lasts forever. He tested 3 people. He was careful about how he collected the samples. He was methodical. He documented everything. And then he sent the kit back and he waited. He waited for 11 weeks. And in those 11 weeks, he continued to live his life in that house with that family, eating dinner at the same table, sleeping in the same bed, being the same Gerald that everyone expected him to be. And he watched. The weeks passed the way waiting always passes. Slowly when you are conscious of it. Then suddenly in blocks when something else demands your attention. Gerald went to work. He managed his projects. He attended Daniel's school event in the 5th week and sat in the 3rd row and clapped when his son's name was called, and nobody in that hall would have known that anything was wrong. But Celine noticed something. Celine was the observational one in the family, the child who had always been quietly perceptive in a way that sometimes made people around her uncomfortable. She noticed the way her father had changed in how he looked at things. Not at people specifically. At objects. At rooms. As if he was cataloging them. She asked him once, during a weekend when Marcus had come home and the family had eaten together, whether he was feeling well. She said it casually, passing him in the kitchen. She didn't make it an event. Gerald said he was fine. He said he'd been tired from a difficult project. He smiled when he said it. The smile reached his eyes because Gerald had always been a man capable of controlling what his face showed. But Celine didn't entirely believe him. She told a friend later that she had the sense her father was carrying something heavy. She couldn't name what it was. She just felt the weight of it from across the room. Meanwhile, Gerald had been doing something else in those 11 weeks. He had been researching. Not the DNA service. Something more specific. He had been looking into records. Historical documents. Trying to trace a thread that had started with the photograph and kept pulling. What he found, and investigators would later piece this together from his search history and the notes he kept in a locked document on his laptop, was that there was a period of approximately 8 months in Vivian's life, occurring between 2 years before they met and the year they began dating, that she had never fully accounted for. It wasn't unusual on its surface. People move. People change jobs. People go through periods they don't discuss. Gerald had never had reason to ask detailed questions about that time because Vivian had never given him reason to ask. But he was asking now. And the more he looked, the less he found. Which, to a man who understood how things were built and how they could be hidden, was itself an answer. Something had happened in those 8 months. Something that had been carefully, deliberately removed from the version of herself that Vivian had brought into their marriage. Gerald wrote in his notes, not absence of information. Removal of it. Different thing. He was right about that. He was right about several things. The problem was that being right was going to cost him something he hadn't calculated for. The results arrived on a Tuesday. He never saw them. The night Gerald Oak died was a Monday. He came home from work at the usual time. Vivian was in the studio finishing an order. Daniel was in his room. Gerald made himself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and read the news on his phone for approximately 20 minutes. This was documented later by the phone's activity log. At some point that evening the family ate dinner together. This was not unusual. Vivian had cooked. There was no argument. Neighbors heard nothing. Daniel would later describe the dinner as normal, maybe quieter than usual, but he qualified that by saying his father had often been quiet in recent months. Gerald went to bed early. This was slightly unusual. He typically stayed up until close to midnight, but not dramatically unusual. He had mentioned fatigue. He said goodnight to Vivian. She came to bed later. At 2:09 in the morning, Vivian woke up and found that Gerald was not breathing. She called emergency services. The operator documented the call as starting at 2:11 a.m. She was described as distressed but coherent. The paramedics arrived and Gerald Oak was declared dead at 2:34 a.m. Initial assessment suggested cardiac arrest. Gerald had no diagnosed heart condition, but he was 54 and cardiac events in men of that age without prior diagnosis are not unheard of. The doctors were not immediately suspicious. The family was shattered. Marcus drove through the night to get home. Celine was unreachable for the first hour because she had her phone on silent. Daniel sat in the living room and did not speak for a long time. Vivian was surrounded by family members who came quickly. She was described by everyone who saw her that morning as devastated. But here is where the timeline becomes important. Gerald's phone was on the bedside table when paramedics arrived. His laptop was in the study, closed as it usually was at night. His car keys were on the hook by the door. Nobody touched any of these things. That was what the family agreed on later. But at 6:12 in the morning, 4 hours after Gerald had been declared dead, the DNA results arrived in his secondary email inbox. The email was never opened from Gerald's devices. The question that investigators would later return to again and again was this: who else knew that email was coming? Because someone in that house had known Gerald was waiting for something. Someone had been watching him the way he had been watching them. And the timeline of that Monday night, who was where, what was said, what was consumed at dinner and in what quantities, would eventually become the most scrutinized 7 hours in that family's history.
It was Marcus who found the email. He had been given access to his father's main email account by Vivian to help manage the flood of messages that arrives when someone dies. Condolences, bank notifications, subscriptions that need cancelling. The administrative weight of a person's life arriving after they are gone. Marcus was going through the inbox methodically on the third day after his father's death when he noticed something. The main inbox was clean. Gerald had been organized. But Marcus saw a forwarding rule that Gerald had set up. All emails arriving to a secondary address were being quietly copied to the main inbox, hidden under a folder labeled Project Archive. Marcus opened the folder. There were 11 emails from the DNA testing service, confirmation of kit receipt, processing updates. Then the final one, sent at 6:12 a.m. on Tuesday morning. He opened it. He read it. He sat very still for a long time. Then he closed the laptop and went and sat in his car in the driveway for 40 minutes before he came back inside. What the results showed was this. Of the 3 individuals Gerald had tested, only one was a biological match to him. Not 2. 1. Marcus was Gerald's biological son. Celine was not Gerald's biological daughter. And Daniel, the youngest, the one still in school, the one Gerald had sat beside at that school event 5 weeks before he died and applauded for, Daniel shared no biological relationship with Gerald at all. Not a partial match, not a distant one. None. Which meant that whatever had happened, it had not happened once. It had happened more than once. And it had been happening across the entire span of their marriage. Vivian had built a family with Gerald Oak. A house. A life. 26 years of ordinary Tuesdays and shared meals and small disagreements and holidays and all the accumulated texture of a long marriage. And inside that life, she had been concealing something that made the entire structure of it a fiction. Gerald had suspected one lie. What the DNA showed was a pattern. And patterns don't happen by accident. Patterns require decisions, repeated ones. Decisions made in full knowledge of what they were doing to another person. Gerald had written in his notes, near the end, "I keep trying to find the version of this that I can live with." He never got the chance to find out if one existed. Marcus did not tell Vivian what he had found. Not immediately. He thought about it for 2 days. He went over the results again and again, not because he didn't understand them, but because understanding them and accepting what they implied were two completely different things. The results implied that someone in his family had a secret large enough to kill for. He knew he was making a leap. He understood that. His father had died of what appeared to be a cardiac event, and there was no official indication of foul play. He tried to hold that in mind. But his father had been healthy. His father had been watchful and careful and had clearly known that something dangerous was close. His father had used a secondary email, had kept a locked document, had researched privacy policies with the focus of someone who was afraid of being found out. Gerald had been afraid. Not of the results, of what would happen when someone else learned he had ordered them. Marcus went back through his father's behavior over the preceding months. He thought about the dinner on the Monday night. He thought about who had been present. He thought about who had access to the house and to the kitchen and to the things Gerald ate and drank. He thought about Vivian. He thought about the man who had fathered Celine, whoever he was. A man who had presumably been in contact with Vivian at some point. A man who might have something to lose. He thought about Daniel, who was 17 and who had no idea who his biological father was, or whether that man was someone who was still present in some way in their lives. He thought about the 8-month gap in Vivian's history that Gerald had been researching. And then he went to the police. He didn't make an accusation. He brought the results, and he brought his father's laptop, and he told them what he had found, and he asked them to look at the Monday night again, more carefully this time. The police reopened the file, and when they did, several things that had seemed insignificant began to matter. A neighbor had seen a car parked briefly on their street on the Monday evening. Not for long. It hadn't been there before, and it wasn't there after. Nobody had thought to mention it because nobody had thought there was anything to mention. Gerald's teacup had been washed and replaced in the cupboard by the time anyone thought to examine the kitchen. Vivian had said she had tidied up as a reflex. She couldn't explain why she had done it at 2:30 in the morning when her husband had just been found dead. She said she didn't remember doing it. She said, "Grief makes people do strange things." That was true. Grief does make people do strange things. But the forensic team noted that the cup was exceptionally clean. Cleaner, they said, than ordinary washing would typically achieve. They requested a toxicology screening that had not been included in the initial post-mortem. They began interviewing family members separately, and one by one, the stories that had seemed consistent began to show their seams. The toxicology report came back in the 3rd week of the investigation. Gerald Oak had not died of a cardiac event. He had died of poisoning. A compound introduced in sufficient quantity to cause cardiac arrest in a healthy adult. A compound that would not have been identified without a specific and targeted screening, because it does not appear in standard postmortem panels. Because whoever had used it had known this. This was not a crime of passion. This was not an impulsive act committed in a moment of panic or anger. This was planned. The person who did this had researched what they were using. They had sourced it. They had calculated the amount. They had introduced it in a way that mimicked natural death, and they had taken steps immediately afterwards. The washed cup, the agreement about the phone and the laptop, to make sure there was no reason to look deeper. And they had almost succeeded. If Marcus had not found the email, if Gerald had not been careful enough to create a forwarding rule, if there had been just slightly less of a paper trail, this would have been recorded as a cardiac death and closed within the week. But the investigation was now open, and it led somewhere none of them had fully anticipated. Because when they traced the biological fathers of Celine and Daniel, they found that these were not casual affairs. These were not isolated moments of weakness or opportunity. Vivian had been in contact with both men across the span of years. Not continuously, but periodically, in a way that suggested these relationships had not simply ended. One of these men had a history that was extremely difficult to access, because he had, at one point, operated under a different identity. The 8 months that Gerald had been trying to trace in Vivian's history were 8 months she had spent with this man, in a different city, under circumstances she had never disclosed to anyone in her current life. What she had been doing during those 8 months, and who she had been doing it with, and what that man had needed from her in exchange for what he provided. This was the secret under the secret. This was what Gerald had been getting close to. Not the affairs. The affairs were the surface. What was underneath them was a connection to someone who had far more at stake than a paternity scandal. Someone for whom exposure would mean something significantly more serious than embarrassment. And that person had been watching Gerald get closer. They had known about the DNA test, not because Vivian had told them, because someone else in that family had. The investigation eventually produced 3 arrests. Vivian Oak was arrested 14 days after the toxicology results came back. She was charged with her husband's murder. The evidence against her was circumstantial in parts and direct in others. The washed cup, her movements on the Monday evening, telephone records that placed calls to a number she had initially denied knowing, made in the 48 hours before Gerald died. She maintained for a long time that she had not known Gerald was going to be killed, that she had known he was investigating, that she had panicked and told the wrong person, that she had not understood what would happen. The second arrest was of a man who had been, for many years, a silent and entirely invisible presence in that family's life. He had fathered Daniel. He was the man from the 8 months in Vivian's past. He was the man with a second identity, and the reasons for it that investigators described only in the broadest terms during the trial, due to matters that remained under separate proceedings. He had sourced the compound. He had arranged its delivery. He had been the car on the street on Monday evening. The third arrest was the one that silenced the courtroom when it was announced. Celine. Celine, who had been the observational one, the perceptive one, the one who had noticed her father's behavior changing, the one who had noticed it because she had been watching for it, because she had been told to watch for it. Celine had known about her biological father for 3 years. He had made contact with her, had built a relationship with her outside the knowledge of anyone in the family, had, over time, positioned her as the person inside that house who could tell him what Gerald was doing and when, and how close he was getting. Celine had been the one who told him about the DNA test. She had found the testing kit in Gerald's car. She hadn't known exactly what he had collected samples from, but she had known he had sent it. She had reported this. And 2 weeks before the results were due, that information had set a sequence of events in motion that ended with Gerald Oak dead in his bed at 2 in the morning on a Monday, and an email arriving 4 hours later with the truth he had spent 11 weeks waiting for. Celine did not believe, she said, that her father would be killed. She said she had only been passing information. She said she hadn't understood what would be done with it. Whether that was true was a question the court spent a long time examining. What is not in question is this. Gerald Oak spent 8 months watching a family he loved, while quietly trying to find a reason to keep trusting them. He found the opposite. And the careful, methodical, patient way he went about it, the secondary email, the locked documents, the forwarding rule, the privacy research, was not enough to protect him. But it was enough to make sure the truth survived him. The email arrived at 6:12 in the morning. Gerald never read it, but it found its way to the people who needed to see it. And sometimes that is the only justice available. Not the one that arrives in time, the one that arrives anyway.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.